What's up? This is a response to Tito Garcia's video from earlier today about Dennis Rodman, being a Hall of Famer, and this is his opinion that it's sort of laughable that anyone would think he's a Hall of Famer. And I'm a Bulls fan, right? So yeah, I'm biased to an extent. I'm not gonna sit there and act like my personal feelings never make their way into my observations about shit. I mean, I just think everybody's biased to an extent. It's just some people are more fair than others. But yeah, even with me, man, I have Dennis Rodman like as the 10th greatest power forward of all time. But I can understand someone saying, "How the fuck do you have him ahead of, people like Dan Essel, or Connie Hawkins, or even Weber, you know, uh, Dave Cowens, if you consider him a power forward. I consider him more of a for five. But there's other people out there historically. Spencer Haywood, like, how can you put him ahead of these guys? Like, some people like it's laughable. And I don't know, man. Maybe some of it is personal bias. But before I go further, I want to disagree with you on two things you said in the video. One thing I think you said was you didn't feel as if Bill Walton's a Hall of Famer. And if you're talking about as far as NBA, because the Hall of Fame is for basketball, which includes college too. Now, if you're talking about NBA, yeah, I agree. Like, as great as Bill Walton was in the few years that he was in his prime, he didn't play at the level that I think warrants a Hall of Fame induction or consideration in the NBA. Maybe no more than 3 or 4 seasons, tops. For most of his career, he didn't even play, or he was at a level where, he was good, but, Hall of Fame worthy. No, I think he gets in more because of his UCLA career. Like that, I think his collegiate career is at least top 3. I wouldn't you can make the argument he had the greatest collegiate career of all time. You know what I'm saying? Like, he was awesome. Just an awesome player. So I think he gets in more because of his collegiate career. And I also disagree. I think you said Mutombo had higher career rebound average than Rodman, and that's not true. I looked it up, and Mutombo averaged 10.3 rebounds per game, and Rodman 13.5. Though, to be fair, the last maybe 5 years of his career, maybe something like that, Mutombo wasn't a starter anymore, and that crapped into his averages. But I think in his prime, Mutombo probably averaged somewhere close to 12 rebounds a game, probably somewhere around that range. But I will say this: Mutombo was probably, during the latter stages of Dennis Rodman's career, past 1992, he probably was the second best rebounder in the NBA, even more so than Barkley by that stage, because injuries had taken a toll on Charles and his lifestyle. But this is the reason why I think Dennis Rodman is at least a borderline Hall of Famer. Okay, I understand your argument about Dennis Rodman only averaging like 5 points a game. I think it was like 4.7 or some shit like that. And yeah, I understand. He didn't average a lot of points, right? And this is where my personal bias comes in to effect. And I know it does. I'm admitting it. I know I have a personal bias on this. I'm not a big fan of today's NBA basketball. Anybody listening to my videos can know that, right? I'm hating on a generation. A lot of people say, "Oh, you're just hating on this generation." It's not a generational thing, man. I just don't like. I've never been a huge fan of like 140 to 130. It's fine to have those things in snippets, but I think too much of it is a bad thing. So like just eating, everybody loves pie, everybody loves cake, everybody loves candy, pizza, and burgers and shit like that. But it should be done in moderation. You know what I'm saying? Like, too much of it kind of fucks up. You know what I'm saying? Like, I look at the rule changes, the the gradual change toward more of a perimeter-oriented game as far as players, and the league wanting to use 140 to 135 blowout. I mean, not blowout. 140 to 135. Shootout games. I prefer the mid to late 90s Miami, New York, or Miami, Chicago Bulls, or Bulls, Knicks, like those grinded out 70 to 68 wins, 70 to 68 games. I know it comes off as boring to the casual fan, but that's what I always loved in the NBA, like those defensive, like, it's like in football. I prefer the 14, 13 games that come down to the field goal kicker. I prefer those games over those 45, 41 shootouts. That's just me. But I can understand the argument that Dennis Rodman was an anemic offensive player. I will say this, though. Dennis didn't particularly seem interested in scoring. Was it because he couldn't score? I don't know. He did lead the NBA in field goal percentage one year. I think it was the 90-91 season, or it was the 89-90 season. I think it was the 89-90 season. He led the NBA in scoring. I think it was like 59.5%. Right? And yeah, he did it mostly off layups and dunks and fast break transitional baskets and shit like that. But, from what I always remember, Dennis, I'm going by what he would say now. He would just say that offense never interested him. It wasn't interesting to him. But I think that the reasons why he's in the Hall of Fame is because of number two, his defense, but number one, his rebounding. And I think it's his rebounding that gets him in the Hall of Fame, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Dennis was not the most decorated player. I think he only played in like 3 All-Star games. But then, to be fair, Reggie Miller only played in four All-Star games, and he played 18 seasons, if I'm not mistaken. So I think it was 4. I think he only had 4 All-Star selections. But he's in the Hall of Fame. And not too many people refute him, because he did put up 25,000 points and had some memorable playoff moments, But you can make a great argument that Reggie is a little overrated. But it's his rebounding. And Dennis is quite a 2-time Defensive Player of the Year winner. But it's his rebounding. That's what gets him in the Hall of Fame. Dennis Rodman is a historically gifted rebounder. And I understand the argument that you made about if Charles Barkley only focused on rebounding, he would do the same thing, maybe a little bit better. But I tend to disagree. Because, generally speaking, whenever I saw Dennis Rodman and Charles Barkley match up against one another, I'm not going to say that every time Rodman out-rebounded Charles, but more often, I would say 70% of the time, Rodman out-rebounded Charles, and sometimes it was embarrassing. Like he would out-rebound him 18 to 8, 19 to 11, 23 to 9. It wasn't close at all. And one thing about Rodman is that, Charles, he got his rebounds through sheer will. He got his rebounds through sheer will and determination. Rodman got most of his rebounds through was more cerebral with him. He knew, because he had to be the king. Like, Rodman may have had years where he averaged 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 rebounds, 19 rebounds a game. But it also had to be another 10 rebounds that he was just that close to getting. Like, I never seen a guy who always had his hands, so many times he had his hands, because he had that tip thing that he used to do. he almost it was, he would get 23 rebounds, but then it'd be like another 5 or 6 rebounds or 7 rebounds that he almost fucking got that went out of bounds, or he just couldn't quite get to it. The guy was a fucking menace. Even Shaquille O'Neal, who in his prime years was in those years when Rodman was leading the league in rebounding. Shaquille O'Neal said that the hardest guy that he had to face as far as like rebounding against wasn't Barkley, wasn't Olajuwon, who he has the utmost respect for, wasn't Dale Robinson, wasn't Mutombo, all right, not Jason Williams, and I'm not talking about the point guard. I'm talking about the murderer that's in prison, or was in prison. I think he's still in prison for the New Jersey Nets. I think earlier he played with Philly. He played with Barkley. Not him, okay, not these other guys, Kemp or whatever. He said was Rodman. And when I say that he's a historically great rebounder, I'll put it like this. Wilt Chamberlain averaged 22.9 rebounds per game. Bill Russell, 22.5. But Dennis Rodman, 13.5. And you look at that and you're like, well, he's nowhere in their class. I mean, these guys are averaging 9 plus more boards than him over a career. Like, it's no contest. This is the thing. When Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain were playing back in the 50s and 60s, they were playing at a pace that even the Golden State Warriors couldn't keep up with. I think back in those days, I'm a little bit rusty, but I think back in the peak, like early 60s, mid 60s, when they were just frenetic up and down the court, those guys used to just take the first available shot. Like the first good look, they would just take that shot. If they missed it, rebound, go back to the other side of the court, then they'll take the first available shot, go in or miss. Like they didn't really have a lot of set plays that they would have, except for if they would go to like certain players like Wilt or whatever. But back then, teams used to average something like, I think it was something like maybe 110 possessions or 120 possessions or something like that. 120 possessions, 111 shot attempts, 110 shot attempts. That's unheard of today. Unheard of. And if you have you have a faster pace and you have more possessions, you're going to have many more rebounding opportunities. And during the early 60s, teams averaged about 70 to 75 rebounds per game. I think in that 61-62 season, the Philadelphia Warriors, because I was in Philadelphia at the time, I think they averaged something about around 75 rebounds per game. I think the league average was about 71, right? So I think that year averaged 25.7 rebounds. Well, during the mid to late 90s, when Rodman was averaging 15, 16 rebounds a game, the Bulls were maybe averaging about 40, maybe, rebounds per game. So Dennis Rodman was getting over 40% of the team's total rebounds, as opposed to Wilt and Bill getting like 28, 29, 30, 31%. In fact, if you take Dennis Rodman's greatest rebounding season, which is 91-92, and 91-92, and you would like proportion it out to that era, Rodman would be getting like 31, 32, 33 rebounds a game in that era. Also, another thing was that Dennis Rodman, when he was leading the league in rebounding for those 7 consecutive seasons, he was doing it like he was far outpacing everybody. Like, it's kind of forgotten that Kevin Willis had a fucking monster season in 91-92. A monster fucking season for Atlanta. Averaged 15 and a half rebounds a game. 15 and a half rebounds, right? Yet he was still over 3 rebounds behind Dennis Rodman that year. So yeah, I think when it comes to rebounding, when you rebound at a historic level, that warrants at least Hall of Fame consideration. And then the championships, the 5 championships, that's the icing on the cake, just enough to put him in the Hall of Fame. But I understand people saying he's one-dimensional. Well, he wasn't. But the flip side of that is, if you take a guy who's offensively gifted, like let's say there's a guy who's putting up 35 points a game, right? Shooting blistering, like 55, 56% from the field. But he's the worst defensive player, one of the worst defensive players of all time. Does he get into the Hall of Fame? Now, this isn't quite the same. This isn't quite the same example, but I look at a guy like Steve Nash. Statistically, you can make the argument that Steve Nash is the greatest shooter of all time. Ray Allen, for his career, shot about 45, I think it was 45.2%. Right at 40% for his career in threes. I think he shot like 89.3% from the foul line for his career. I think he's like top 10 all time in free throw percentage, Ray Allen. Then you got Reggie Miller, 47% from the field from his career, 39.5% from three-point range, and 88.8% from the foul line. I think he's like top 15 all time in free throw percentage. Larry Bird, 49.6%. 37.6% from beyond the arc, 88.6% from the foul line. All right, Stephen Curry, 0.7% from the field, 44.4% from three-point range, third all-time in free throw percentage, 90.2%. I mean, just phenomenal shooting percentages. You know, these are some of the greatest shooters I've ever seen in the modern era. And you have Mark Price, 47% from the field, over 42% from three-point range. I think it was close to 43%. Matter of fact, I think it is over 43%. And then he's the second greatest foul shooter of all time. But then you have Steve Nash, 49% from the field, 43% from three-point range, and the greatest foul shooter of all time, 90.4%. And Nash was only 6'3", but he listed as 6'3", but probably more like 6'1.5". I'm taller than Steve Nash. And, you know, he wasn't the biggest guy. He was smaller. He was about the same size as John Stockton. And I think some people can say, like, Stephen Curry fans will be like, well, Stephen shot more three-pointers, so that's why, you know, his overall field goal percentage is lower. But if you take out threes, Stephen Curry's at 50.3%, Nash at 52%. So it's not that. It's just that, like I said, Nash is the greatest all-around shooter I've ever seen. Not the greatest scorer, but the greatest shooter all around that I think I've ever seen. But on defense, Nash was at times abysmal, if not just downright awful. But he's going to be in the Hall of Fame because, you know, of his shooting and passing ability, like, you know, which is more geared on the offensive side of things. So that's the flip side of it. And I think the last thing I'll say in this video is that you made a pretty good point about saying that, well, Dennis Rodman was never the best player on any of his teams, you know. But I mean, when you play with the likes of people like, you know, Isaiah Thomas and Joe Dumars, David Robinson, you know, Scottie Pippen, Michael Jordan, you know, Shaq, Kobe, you know, now in Dallas, you know, by that time I think he was just toward the end, but, you know, and Dirk hadn't really developed quite yet as a player, but you can make the argument that, okay, Robert Parrish never was the best player on any of his teams. Like, when Robert Parrish was in Boston, he was at best the third best player on those teams, you know. And shit, you got to give consideration to Cedric Cohen, Brad Maxwell, you know. But yeah, Robert Parrish was never any more than the third best player on those teams. And by the time he was with the Hornets, he was probably, you had Mourning, Johnson. Yeah, he was still just the third best player on his teams. And then toward the end, he was like the fourth best. Then he was, at the end, he was just finished his career with Chicago. But still, I think it's kind of flawed to just go by that argument. And I think also people might say something, well, by the time, Barkley was sort of like not washed up, but, by the time Rodman was with the Bulls, Barkley was sort of washed up. And, so nobody told Charles to live that type of lifestyle. Nobody told Charles to stay out and party until 4 o'clock in the morning, knowing he got a fucking game the next day at noon. And Dennis Rodman was living, partying like crazy too. The difference is that Dennis took care of his body as far as like working out and eating right. Charles wanted to fucking eat himself to a fucking, put on 20 fucking pounds during the off season, and then toward the end of his career, he couldn't fucking take it off that easy anymore. And also, Rodman was older than Barkley. We got to remember that. By the time Dennis Rodman joined the Chicago Bulls, he was already, 34 years old. Even his last year with the Bulls, he was 37. He was ancient by NBA standards, still averaging 15 rebounds a game. So, I mean, Dennis Rodman was a tremendous rebounder, man. I mean, he averaged 13.5 rebounds per game for his career, but in those 8 years where he was a starter, from 1990 to 1998, he averaged 16.1 rebounds in 36 minutes. He did not play heavy minutes like a Chamberlain who averaged 45 minutes a game, or Bill Russell who averaged 42 minutes per game. He played in his prime, between 6 to 9 minutes fewer than Chamberlain and Russell, in an era where there was about 30 fewer rebound possessions per team. So historically, I think if you're a historically gifted rebounder, you at least warrant Hall of Fame consideration. It's sort of like this too. Let's go to baseball. Roger Maris is not a Hall of Famer, even though people that love Roger Maris, he should be in the Hall of Fame for the 61 rebounds. No, he shouldn't, just because of one season doing it. I think he only had 275 in his career, right? But if Roger Maris had, with that 61 home run season, let's say he had a horrible batting average and all that other shit, but let's say he had 7 other seasons with 50 home runs. Plus, let's say he had 5 World Series to go with that. But he was a horrible batting average guy. Now, I guess that would make him Mark McGwire, right? Now, if you take out the steroid aspect of it, McGwire only had a .263 batting average, but he led the league led the majors in home runs. Let's see. 96 he had 52. 97 total league was 58. So that's 2. 98 70. 99 65. Okay, so 4 years he led Major League Baseball in home runs. Now imagine if he did that for 3 additional seasons, even though he only batted .263 for his career, and no steroids. Wouldn't he be in the Hall of Fame? Plus another, let's say he was on 5 World Series teams, but he just had a horrible. Matter of fact, even a better example than that, Dave Kingman, calm. I think he only batted .236 for his career, right? .236 back in the 60s, the 70s and 80s, right? I think he finished his career with the Chicago Cubs. I think they never re-signed him because he was an asshole. I remember reading something about he mailed he gave a reporter like a dead rat in a box or some shit. Nobody fucking liked him. I think his career ended with the Oakland Athletics, not the Chicago Cubs, excuse me. No team wanted to sign him, But he only hit .236 for his career. But let's say he had 7 seasons where he led the majors in home runs. 40 In the 70s, the home runs were a little bit lower, but let's say he hit like 40 home runs, had a couple seasons hitting, let's say 45 to 55 home runs, and he led the majors in home runs 7 years, and he was on 5 World Series teams. He probably would be in the Hall of Fame, despite that average, despite being possibly a horrible defensive player. You see, I'm going with that. So that's my argument about Dennis Rodman, man.